594 BCE, Athens, Greece. Did you ever know this true story, the one they tried to bury beneath law books and marble statues? Did you ever imagine that poverty itself was once a crime, and debt a chain stronger than iron? Across the ancient world, millions of ordinary people woke each morning knowing that a single unpaid loan could erase their freedom, their families, even their names.
Today, this is the story I will explain. The hidden history of legal slavery of the poor when debt destroyed lives. A story not of criminals or conquerors, but of farmers, laborers, widows, and children whose lives were legally consumed by numbers written on clay tablets, parchment, and stone. Because long before prisons became common, societies across Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, medieval Europe, and beyond solved poverty not with mercy but with ownership, creating systems where debt was enforceable by law through bondage, forced labor, and hereditary servitude. And to understand how this happened, we must return to the earliest cities where money itself was born, in ancient Sumer around 3000 BCE, where barley loans and silver debts were recorded meticulously, and failure to repay meant that a debtor could be seized along with his wife or children and forced into labor for the creditor's household, not as a criminal, but as legal property, a practice embedded so deeply into society that even kings acknowledged its danger, which is why rulers like Hammurabi later issued debt relief edicts, not out of kindness but to prevent social collapse. Because when too many citizens became enslaved by debt, armies weakened and rebellions grew. Yet even these temporary reprieves could not erase the underlying system, and as centuries passed, this logic spread and evolved, reaching ancient Athens, where small farmers borrowed against their land and bodies, pledging themselves as collateral. And when crops failed or interest compounded beyond reach, they became hektemeroi, debt bondsmen who worked their own land but surrendered a sixth of their harvest to creditors, living permanently on the edge of enslavement until the crisis grew so severe that Athenians sold their own children abroad to pay debts, prompting the lawgiver Solon in 594 BCE to enact the Seisachtheia, the shaking off of burdens, canceling debts, and freeing those enslaved by them, a moment often celebrated as progress, yet revealing how normalized debt slavery had already become. Because such reforms were rare and fragile, and outside moments of crisis, most societies continued to believe that owing money justified owning people. Nowhere more systematically than in Rome, where the law of nexum allowed a citizen who defaulted to be bound in chains and forced to work for his creditor, fed meager rations, publicly displayed as a warning. And while Roman pride later claimed that nexum was abolished, debt bondage merely transformed, with creditors using legal manipulation to seize land, reduce families to tenant farmers, and funnel the poor into seen as legal forms of servitude that fed Rome's expansion, while children born into these households inherited not freedom but obligation, growing up knowing their lives were measured in denarii. And when Rome collapsed, the idea did not vanish but adapted, reappearing in medieval Europe through serfdom, a system often misunderstood as stable or benign, when in reality many peasants entered serfdom not by birth but by desperation, surrendering freedom for protection during famine, war, or debt, binding themselves and their descendants to estates where leaving without permission was illegal, where marriage, labor, and movement were controlled, and where debt compounded across generations, transforming temporary survival agreements into permanent social classes, a pattern repeated across Asia as well. In ancient India, where debt bondage trapped entire families, and in China, where peasants sold themselves or their children during hard years, creating cycles of dependency that law reinforced rather than challenged. Because in these societies, poverty was framed not as misfortune, but as moral failure, a sign of irresponsibility or weakness, justifying harsh enforcement. And this mindset crossed oceans into the early modern world, where European colonial powers exported debt slavery through indentured servitude, a system marketed as opportunity, but often functioning as legalized exploitation. As millions of poor Europeans signed contracts they could not read, binding themselves to years of labor in colonies where conditions extended contracts indefinitely, punishing resistance with violence that the law permitted, while local populations were trapped through taxes payable only in colonial currency, forcing them into labor systems that mimicked ancient debt bondage under modern administration. And even after chattel slavery was abolished in the 19th century, lawmakers crafted new legal tools to preserve control over the poor, from peonage laws in the Americas that criminalized debt default, to vagrancy statutes that allowed authorities to arrest unemployed individuals and lease them to private employers, effectively resurrecting slavery through legal language. And throughout these centuries, the victims shared common traits. They were poor, often illiterate, lacking political power, and trapped by contracts designed to benefit creditors. And what made these systems so enduring was not cruelty alone, but legality. Because when suffering is written into law, it becomes invisible, normalized, and self-perpetuating. Neighbors stop seeing chains and start seeing obligations. Judges stop seeing humans and start seeing balances. And children born into these systems learn early that their futures are negotiable assets, a reality captured in court records where infants were listed alongside livestock as security, where marriages required creditor approval, and where escape was punished not as self-defense but as theft of property. And even moments of reform reveal the fear elites held of the poor, as debt cancellations were framed not as justice but as emergency measures to prevent revolt, confirming that societies understood the violence of these systems, yet chose to preserve them when convenient. And the emotional toll of debt slavery extended beyond physical labor into identity itself, as individuals lost legal personhood, unable to testify, own property, or protect their families, living in constant uncertainty where illness, drought, or market shifts could trigger irreversible loss, a condition echoed chillingly in personal letters and petitions begging rulers for relief, documents that survive as whispers from people erased by accounting. And as we move closer to the modern era, it becomes uncomfortable to recognize how familiar these patterns remain. Because while explicit debt slavery is illegal today, systems of economic coercion persist that echo the past,
reminding us that the boundary between obligation and ownership has always been thin, shaped by law rather than morality. And the history of legal slavery of the poor forces us to confront an unsettling truth, that societies repeatedly chose order over compassion, profit over dignity, and stability over freedom, crafting laws that transformed financial failure into lifelong punishment. And the most haunting aspect of this history is not that cruelty existed, but that it was considered reasonable, necessary, even just, written calmly into statutes and contracts, debated politely by elites while families disappeared into ledgers. And as the centuries pass in this story, from clay tablets to parchment to printed codes, the language changes, but the logic remains, that those who owe are less deserving, more controllable and expendable. And when we look back at these systems, it is tempting to view them as relics of a darker age, yet they were created by societies that considered themselves civilized, advanced, and lawful. A reminder that progress is not guaranteed and that legality does not equal justice. And by understanding how debt destroyed lives in the past, we gain insight into the quiet power of law to define who is free and who is not, a power that has always rested not in chains alone, but in words, numbers, and the silent acceptance of those who benefit from them, leaving us with a question that history refuses to answer for us. If poverty once made people property, how far are we truly from repeating the same mistake under a different name?